and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we're going to tackle a subject which appears to give pianists quite a lot of problems. The piano music of Franz Liszt represents many things to many people. To some, it's about technical and musical mastery. To others, it's about spiritual contemplation. And to still others, it is simply about showing off to a crowd. Within all of these approaches, we have unmistakable elements in his music which are very common, and which require our understanding in order to get to the performance-driven levels of divine connection or playing to the crowd. Liszt relied on improvisation, or the impression of improvisation in his pieces, and this is entirely lost on many pianists who approach his music for the first time. This is understandable, because in many respects, his music is unique in the piano canon precisely because of this trait. We cannot apply the usual rules of interpretation building to Liszt. We have to try to understand the improvisational halo in his pieces in order to help clarify why we can, and in some cases must, make certain musical choices in interpretation that we would not normally make. Follow me now. Vallée d'Obermann is in some ways typical in terms of construction for a character-driven piece by Liszt. This opening can be very confusing on a first attempt, because Liszt constructs it using many different ideas, many unresolved cadences and gestures, and many key changes which do not necessarily provide a harmonic basis or a core key that can be contrasted against. In earlier classical works, we rely upon an establishment of the home key in the first few bars. This sets the table, so to speak. But look at what Liszt does here. The very first gesture of the piece begins as a dissonance that leads to a vague resolution. This indication of a key center is destroyed immediately by a sudden shift. Are we to think we're in G minor? Well, that idea goes out the window too, because he goes on to repeat the opening gesture and the sudden key changes as well, ending up in B flat minor. Think about this. We start in almost E minor, shift to G minor, and then at the very end up in B flat minor. E to B flat is an augmented fourth, or diminished fifth. This is the most distant key relation possible. It's not like he's going from C major to A minor, or G major to D major. Liszt makes the largest shift possible. This kind of unresolved situation is not limited to the harmonic center or lack thereof. The left-hand melody seems to be searching, or at least seemingly unsettled for most of the time. The rhythmic stress in the first gesture is away from the main beat. This again points to a rejection of stability, this time from a rhythmic point of view instead of harmonic. We really only feel some form of comfort when he walks down to the brief resolution in bar 4. But this resolution is presented as a problem yet to be solved. Notice what he does with the right-hand accompaniment. He does not resolve the harmony until the very last moment before the left hand moves off again. The right hand, in fact, contributes the whole time to a feeling of movement and continual motion. Notice how the accompaniment avoids the main beats of each bar. Consider how different this would sound if the right hand played a chord on these missing beats. When we play what Liszt wrote, there is a sense of urgency and lack of stability created from the missing chords. So far, we've seen elements that appear to contribute to a character or atmosphere in the piece: unsettled, unpredictable, and unresolved. If we restricted our analysis to these elements and developed an interpretation from them, then we'd achieve a relatively good performance. Certainly, nothing would be wrong with what we'd be representing. But the element of improvisation is in fact present here as well, in these first 8 bars. And though they may seem hidden, they do still carry some importance if we want to have a fully realized interpretation. In many ways, this subject is the core of our episode today, that we could play Liszt from a harmonic and gestural perspective alone, and it would be reasonably successful, or we could incorporate the improvisational aspects that covertly influence Liszt's choices of harmonic progression, gestural cutoff or continuation, and even the timing of when certain melodies appear. When improvisation is taken into account, the interpretation fills out in a more complete way, and can make certain musical elements in this music finally make sense. But understanding and incorporating improvisation is difficult, because it can be used as a generator of musical ideas, or as a commentary on musical ideas. Those are 2 very different things, and must be played accordingly. So, let's look at the opening once again, this time taking improvisation elements into account. When we look at it harmonically, we might say, okay, the opening gives us a clue to a key. If Liszt only wanted to change the gesture, he could have done something like this. But Liszt goes further than this. He changes both gesture and key, and the key so radically that if played the wrong way, can come off as sounding like a complete accident or a mistake. This is what pushes these 4 bars into the territory of improvisation as a generator of material. A change that is so unexpected and so radical compared to what we've heard before, that the first hearing impression is one of being entirely unplanned. Liszt does the smart thing afterwards. He repeats the whole process, just in a different starting key. This assures the listener that this was not an error, or, if it was an error, it's such an awesome mistake that Liszt will happily repeat it. This is improvisation as a commentary on previous material. Now, how does this affect how we approach this opening in terms of how we play it? Many times, we as pianists are faced with music that can succeed or fail, depending solely upon the musical intent we plan on communicating. This is where improvisation and the impression of improvisation is so important to understand. Playing this key change, with delays or stresses on the wrong notes, causes the audience to think, perhaps, that we are skipping to another place in the piece because of a memory slip. On the other hand, if we play straight through this, as if there is nothing important or interesting about it, then we confuse the audience yet again. They're confronted with a strange musical pattern that is played as if it's normal, and the juxtaposition can cause a very unfriendly listening experience. What we have to do with Liszt all too often is understand in his music when he wants the audience to think he's improvising and when to think he's not. Furthermore, if we are representing music that is improvisational in nature, then we have to make sure that we give the impression that there is still a sense of control and order behind the improvisation. In other words, the audience should never feel that we are entirely clueless about what key to play next. Let's consider it from the perspective of gestural and key refusal. After the opening gesture, Liszt immediately moves to another key. He takes a very odd interval, a diminished fourth, to move the melody. In other words, we're saying that Liszt changes his mind after stating a musical gesture that, in itself, has quite a lot of musical potential and tonal stability. He erases all of it and moves on to a brand new key. As I mentioned before, Liszt takes both the setup and the disavowal of the setup and repeats them in different keys. The total effect, from a perspective of composition, is one of him not being sure where he wants to go or where he wants to end up. For us to make this work pianistically, we have to do a few things. First, we know that we have to find a good separation between the two gestures in terms of time. We can't play it straight, like this, and we can't play it with too much time, like this. We need to find that sweet spot in between, where the change is acknowledged to the audience and gives them enough time to process it, but it is not so much time that the audience might think that we're entirely lost. When we establish a timing for this change, then we can adjust sound quality and dynamics to enhance it. This is important to know. If we only changed the timing, then the perception is that we have either made a mistake or are having some kind of memory slip. If, however, we are changing other elements of interpretation like sound quality and dynamics consistent with the change, then the audience perceives that this is within our control. It can be heard as being improvised, but it is definitely not an accident. changing all the elements at once shows some kind of planning, and this is what we need here because of how extreme the opening actually is. Now, in terms of the gestures themselves, we have two basic approaches that are entirely different in nature. The first gesture is flexible. There is no definite origin, and it ends openly without any hard landing or resolution. The second gesture is, by contrast, very stable and traditional, with a firm end. Because of these inherent characteristics, our choices in terms of sound quality, rubato, etc. must reflect this. So, the first gesture, given its nature, can be quite flexible in terms of time and rubato. The second gesture might work really well if we keep things more strict. Once again, we're inserting auditory indications that this is improvisational in nature, but within our control technically and musically. Now, the difficulty in representing improvisation not only exists on the note-to-note basis, but also in terms of how we relate phrases and gestures in the piece. Our first gestures are repeated immediately. We have this, and then we have a little transition to the repetition in a different key. With improvisation comes the mentality that I mentioned earlier, that if we find something that is cool, then we'll probably repeat it, because it's such a good idea. To give this impression pianistically, the first rendering of the theme must appear somewhat hesitant, and the second rendering must appear somewhat more confident or in control. Practically, this means that the second playing of the theme must be different than the first in terms of our limits. We can either make the second playing be more extreme than the first, or less extreme. So, if we make it more extreme, then this means we're using more rubato, more dynamic fluctuation, and in general, we are making a larger difference between the gestures of the two characters. The effect of being in more control than the first time appears because we are controlling more factors to a greater limit than before. We're saying to the audience, I don't just think this is a good idea, it's an awesome idea. The other option is to make the second time more conservative throughout, as if to say to the audience, I came up with a good idea, but now I want you to listen to it more carefully. cannot play the two statements exactly the same. Recognizing improvisation elements in music is quite difficult to do and takes a lot of experience. It's outstandingly difficult to describe in words because in many ways you're trying to pin down musical expectations that are built on what the composer perceives as the average listening habits of an audience. When I talk about Liszt disavowing a musical gesture or idea, that is really a summation of many different compositional techniques that he uses in a single bar. The difficulty here is in recognizing when those techniques combine to create the illusion of improvisation. There's no way that we can confirm or deny if Liszt constructed this piece from an actual improvisation. That's not the point at all. What we're doing is taking musical clues that Liszt provides, extrapolating expectations from those clues to indicate where the phrase should go or how the harmony should develop, and then recognizing how and when Liszt breaks those expectations. How a composer breaks expectations determines how we perceive it. Is it a mistake? Is it an improvisation? Or is it a calculated departure from tradition? Now, this brings us to another important reason why it can be difficult to recognize improvisational elements in music. We must use the music of the time period and before as a reference point. This requires a lot of knowledge, and this is why I say that it's a very difficult thing to do and is reliant upon lots of experience. Earlier, I'd mentioned two distinguishing elements that are affected by improvisation: the generation of material and the commentary upon material. When Liszt repeats the opening gestures, he's commenting on the uniqueness of that first pass. That's interesting. I think I'll do it again. The improvisation is essentially the choice to do it all again. Now, let's consider some other parts of the opening that involve improvisation generating material. First of all, what do I mean when I say that material is generated from improvisation? Well, there are a few factors that need to be in play before we can take an educated guess as to improv-generated material. With Liszt, he's quite clear to show us when he has a harmonic plan that is efficient and conservatively structured. A good example can be found in the middle section of this piece. is well-grounded tonally and balanced structurally, in an almost classical or early Romantic sense. This isn't something that could be easily improvised, and it certainly doesn't sound like it either. There's stability, in other words. Even the key change, from C major to A major, is within the boundaries of reason for this time period. A and C are close because of the relative minor to C. Now, let's compare this stability with the instability that occurs in the previous section. After the opening of the piece, we get a section that gives the audience the impression that Liszt still doesn't really know where he's going with all this. He's essentially presenting musical ideas and trying them out in different keys. Even the chords afterwards, that serve as a bridge back to the first theme, continue to search for something that we're not quite sure of yet. There's a stark contrast in structure and stability between this kind of material and what we heard in the last segment. This is where improvisation comes in, specifically with regards to the generation of material. The best guess we have for improv always starts with a harmonic stability. If there is stability, then most likely the improvisation will be limited to ornamentation of the melody or variation of the theme. Improvised commentary, in other words. If the harmony is not stable, then the door opens to music that is generated by improvisation, where there are no rules at all and anything goes. When Liszt starts the second section, he gives us one idea. He repeats this idea with slight ornamentation. Now he shifts everything, abandoning what he just established to reconnect back to the first theme. That pattern is nearly identical in terms of strategy to the very opening gesture, except this time it's a little extended. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Liszt takes the first gesture and repeats it over and over again, giving more force each time until finally reaching a climax of sorts. But this climax dissolves and peters out into the fundamental constituent elements that make up the gesture. This is where we see a potential area of improvisation generating material. He gives us the first gesture, he repeats this gesture in a more extreme way, harmonically and melodically. Now, the reason we can begin to think that Liszt is improvising here to generate material is that these gestures do not have any harmonic or structural consequences to them. In other words, if I play them as is, they don't lead anywhere, and they don't resolve anything. They're transitions, but not placed structurally as a transition. Furthermore, he takes the gesture and keeps on expanding the range on the keyboard as a build-up to what? When this section ends, we're left exactly where we began in the first place. And the worst part about this is that if this section didn't exist, we wouldn't miss it. In other words, there would be no consequence at all to the piece if we removed this section. This is a form of thematic redundancy that is very common to find in material generated from an improvisation. Essentially, Liszt is playing with an idea, but the idea has value only for the immediate present and not as a structural gear that is required in order to get from one section to another. Let's talk about this for a moment. Efficiency in composition with regards to structure and use of material is a skill that is difficult to master. Beethoven is definitely considered as one of the best composers in both fields, but then again, he slaved over every note, continuously revising and searching for the best solution to his musical problems. Schubert is quite a famous example of a composer that gets criticized for his lack of efficiency in structure. He can come up with amazing melodies, but there are times when it seems like his modulations take too long to occur, and when they do, the payoff is not interesting enough to warrant the journey. When we are dealing with improvisation, the usual failure that occurs if they're written down is the failure of structural integrity, and efficiency is a measure of this. When we don't have efficient structures in music, where the gestures or motives may be repeated with no long-term consequences, the piece, in most cases, is weaker. We wonder, why is this composer making such a big deal of this musical section if it doesn't matter in the long run? This brings up perhaps the most important aspect of Liszt that is, again, quite unique regarding his music. The human performer as an equal to the musical material. In the music of composers before the 20th century, for the most part, the material exists separate to the performer. In other words, the music represents something higher than the human, and the human is supposed to disappear behind the musical facade. The only area in which this does not happen is in improvisation. We see the remnants of this in cadenzas from concerti. All of a sudden, the performer looks like they are controlling the music from their minds, and the musical choices that occur in the material should be perceived as a direct extension of the performer and not the composer. When we get to Liszt, we find music that accepts the conventions of structure, but actively promotes direct sections or even whole pieces to give the impression of being made wholly out of, in the moment, performance of the pianist. The pianist is to be seen as a generator of music, not a transmitter or a conduit, and this generation should be perceived as being improvisation and not pre-planned. This is why understanding improvisation in Liszt is so important. A pianist playing Liszt is Liszt, if the music is played well. Knowing this, let's go back to that area that I just described as being redundant and structurally useless. Obviously, Liszt sees value in this section, and if we look at it from the perspective of the performer becoming Liszt by playing Liszt, then the section gains in value immediately. What is Liszt doing here? Well, first off, we have commentary on the original theme. Then, Liszt expands this, as if he's saying, I like this theme, but I want the audience to remember it without difficulty. What can I do to make this happen? Let's try going higher and louder. This is an easy improvisation in a sense. The material and rhythm don't change in large respects. They're just repeated with emphasis. The ending of this section is again a very easy improvisational choice to make. After the climax, we just thin out everything and slow it down, which is exactly what he writes. Everything that happens here musically is supposed to happen in the moment. It's not supposed to appear as pre-planned or organized. It's supposed to look as if you, the performer, like the music you're coming up with, and are making choices as you go along. What does this mean practically? Well, the first statement, being a repetition of the opening theme, should seem confident but relaxed, as if you're returning to familiar material, which you are. This means playing it reasonably straightforward, but not too metronomic. The second time, you're expanding the range, so you have to give the impression that this is a bit of a stretch for you. If you play it straight through, this doesn't happen at all. You have to take some time before the second statement, as if you are physically stretching for it. As you build up, you take more and more time before each statement, and this is why he eventually writes in the score, rinforzando, underneath the final climactic statement. He's saying, build, 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 until here. When you come down from the climax, the material is essentially dying out. Once again, his directions reinforce this idea. Near the end, he writes ritardando, and ultimately, you have a pause on the rests. The pause on the rests is the time the performer has to think of a new musical idea. In other words, the performer is thinking on their feet. Listen to it from that perspective. Playing Liszt requires us to act. It's not the kind of acting that is overt. We're not looking at the audience and making faces or winking an eye. We're presenting musical ideas that are not reliant upon previously established rules or regulations. If the audience perceives this, then they require an answer to the question of where is this music coming from and where is it going? When we act in Liszt, we essentially show the audience where the music is coming from. And if our choices are subtle enough, then we give the audience the comfort of knowing that even if the music is wandering a bit, we, the performer, are still in full control of where the music will end up. Improvisational material has no sense of inevitability about it, the way that a Bach fugue will. And in truth, that's not the strength of improv material. Improvisation is about the moment, the present, and about exploring this present to its fullest extent. We're not driving on the highway, we're meandering in a museum. If we do this well, then the areas in Liszt's pieces that are structurally sound and classically built show more of their beauty and power. And I think this is what he was going for. We can contrast and compare the two separate approaches, and their strengths benefit from this direct comparison. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and think carefully about the improvisational element in Liszt's music. If you understand it and integrate it into your performances, your interpretations will be very strong indeed. Bye for now.